Have I got a cool story for you guys today. This is one of the very first, if not the first, it's hard to be exactly sure on firsts of things, but certainly one of the very first examples of underwater archaeology. Not salvage to recover treasure, that happened way back into antiquity, but underwater archaeology, exploring a sunken shipwreck simply to learn about it and to learn about its construction. And the shipwreck that we are talking about is the Mega-Yacht of Caligula. Like, how much cooler does it get than that? So Caligula, of course, well-known name, Roman emperor, only ruled for 4 years, 37 to 41. And during this time, he built a pair, not one, but two enormous mega-yachts, floating palaces, literally floating palaces. The first one, the big one, was 240 feet long, 79 feet wide. That's 20 by 80 meters. This thing is massive, huge. Frankly, it's bigger than anyone thought the Roman Empire was able to even build ships. And then he went and did a second one that's nearly as big. It's 230 feet by 66 feet. And you might wonder, where does one sail a floating palace? Well, the answer is you don't, because the west coast of Italy off of Rome it can be fairly storm-swept, tumultuous weather. It's not exactly the place where you want to anchor your giant pleasure yacht. Instead, he goes to a place called Nemi, Lake Nemi, which is a volcanic crater lake about 20 miles south of Rome. It's a tiny lake. It's like about a square mile, I think, in total size. And he puts both the boats in that thing because, hey, there's no tides, there's no storms, it's protected, and essentially they just serve as floating palaces. And I mean, literally palace. There are orchards on these boats, like not huge orchards, but there are trees, there are vines growing on the boats. There are covered, there are balconies, there are walkways, there are covered dining halls. The marble tile on the floors of the boat, brass roof tiles shining gloriously in the sun. The things are every bit as spectacular and excessive as one would expect from the reputation of Caligula. Now, these don't last forever. Of course, Caligula gets assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. No one knows exactly what the history was of the boats after he died. They appear to have been used by a couple of his successors, but ultimately they both end up sinking in the lake. Whether from neglect or deliberately, we don't know. But the local fishermen don't forget about this. It kind of fades from common memory that these boats existed, but the fishermen knew it because every once in a while, sailing around in little boats fishing, they would hook something under the surface and pull up a chunk of what looked like giant Roman galley. So they knew something was down there, and eventually word spread, and in the 1400s, a nephew of Pope Pius II gets interested in this. He's a cardinal at the time, and he comes down to investigate. He goes out on the lake with some of the local fishermen, and sure enough, on a clear day, when the water's nice and calm and clear, you can actually see the outline of at least one of these ships from the surface. Wow, okay, interesting. So he brings in a noted architect of the time, and they come up with a scheme to raise the ship in 1446. What they do is build a gigantic floating raft, and it has some derricks on it and some ropes with hooks. They bring in some swimmers from Genoa who apparently can swim like fish, whose job is to go down and hook these ropes onto the sides, front, back sides of this Roman shipwreck, and then they're going to winch it up to the surface. This plan fails badly because, frankly, the ships, I think, are a bit larger than they really recognized or really appreciated, and they've been stuck in the bottom sand for 1,400 years. And so all the ropes break, the ropes break, the winches break, they're unable to lift the shipwreck up. They bring up some bits and pieces. The swimmers go down there and report back that, this is a really impressive thing. There's structures built on the deck of the ship. There's tile, there's marble, there's brass. They bring up some artifacts. Cool and all, but the project fails. And it would be almost 100 years before anyone tried again. And that is where our really cool part of the story comes in. In 1535, two Italian guys set out to recover the ship In 1535, two Italian guys set out to learn about this ship, to become underwater archaeologists, one of them in particular. The first is an inventor by the name of Guglielmo de Lorena, and he has invented a diving helmet. It's not really a diving bell, it is an individual one-person diving helmet. Which, okay, that sort of thing has kind of been around. Diving bells have certainly been around. And he's used it, apparently, prior to this expedition to recover the guns off of another sunken ship for someone, for government or aristocracy or someone. Anyway, he's used this technology before, and along with him comes a buddy, Francesco de Marchi, who's the guy who's actually going to be doing most of the underwater exploration work here. Now, Marchi is... he's sort of a Renaissance man. He's done a lot. He's designed, in particular, fortifications, and he wrote a book about fortifications in which he actually talks about, he references his diving on these ships in Lake Nemi. So what's interesting, though, is he talks about the mechanism, the diving system that he uses, but he said he swore to keep a secret of exactly how the thing worked, because De Lorena, the guy who invented it, doesn't want people to copy it. It's like there is no patent system in 1535. You want to keep your tech secret, you don't tell anyone about it. So de Marchi is sworn to keep the secret of how it works, but we can kind of figure it out today. So the main wreck, there are two ships. The big one is in shallower water. It's in about 10 meters, about 30 feet of water, which is deep enough that you cannot just use a snorkel. For those of you who aren't deep into diving, so to speak, the problem with a long snorkel is that the volume of air in the snorkel exceeds the volume of air in your lungs, which means you breathe all of your air out into the snorkel. It doesn't actually clear the surface of the water, and then you inhale, and you're just inhaling the exact same air. So you get no new oxygen. You can probably do that a couple times before you have used up most of the oxygen, and now it's all nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and then you suffocate. According to the account, there is also no connecting hose between this dive helmet and the surface. And that's not surprising, really, because like pump and bellows technology of the 1500s wasn't good enough to actually supply a diver 30 feet down. The problem is, the deeper you go, the higher the air pressure, the more pressure you have to put on a pump to get air down to the diver. This is not something that we normally think about. If you're just used to walking around above water, you think of, you can pump up the pressure in a bicycle tire really well. Well, pump sealing technology didn't exist that well, and you're putting a lot of pressure down underwater. Connective hose and bellows systems didn't really work for this depth. And so that does leave us with this interesting question of how did he do it? Well, the answer is he appears to have done it as best we can tell. And I'll link an article discussing this, a cool scholarly article in the description text. But he basically did it the same way that Halley would do it like 300 years later, which is to use inverted, think of them as upside down buckets, weighted buckets that are full of air at the surface. You put a bucket upside down into the water, push it underwater, and you have a pocket of air. And if you weight that bucket enough, you can drop it down underwater containing this slug of compressed air. So it looks like what they probably did is they had one or several upside down cauldrons with a little tube and a valve coming out the top of it, and you'd sink it down to your diver, who would bring that tube inside his dive helmet. This is the sort of helmet that kind of sits at about elbow level, goes up a little above the head. He's got a little crystal glass window in the front that he can use to look out. Big heavy weights, rests on the shoulder. This works fine as long as you're upright. If you trip and fall over, the thing fills with water and you're in deep trouble, literal deep trouble. Anyway, you bring this upside down bucket inside the diving helmet, and you pop the cork out of the tube, and the air inside the bucket is, because it's lower than your helmet, it's a higher pressure, and it goes up into the helmet, refreshes your air, and then there is some sort of exhaust valve. That's kind of up in the air, exactly how the exhaust valve in this dive helmet worked. Either it was like a lever-operated valve. This potentially could have been a tube up to the surface because the pressure, you're trying to take high-pressure air inside the dive helmet and vent it up to low-pressure atmospheric conditions, which would be easy to do with a little, a little manually operated valve. As long as you did it such that you didn't dump all the air out and drown yourself. Or it's also possible that he had essentially a reverse snorkel, where there is a tube leading out of the diving bell that he keeps in the diver's mouth, and you inhale through your nose, you exhale through this snorkel tube, which vents air up and out of the diving bell. Now, if it's something like that, what happens is as you're in it, walking around on the bottom, every time you inhale, you're pulling air out of the tube into your lungs, and then when you exhale through this vent, that air leaves the helmet. And so every breath you take, the water actually rises a little bit more and a little bit more inside the dive helmet. Which is, like, that's fine as long as the guys send down the next bucket of air to you before it gets up above your nose, and again, you drown. Now, DeMarchi reports dives of up to an hour and a half, 30-minute, 60-minute, and longer duration dives with this helmet, which, if we trust that he's telling the truth, and we have good reason to, because we know these boats are real, and the measurements that he made of them turned out to be pretty accurate. He was going around on the bottom, exploring the whole wreck, measuring things with strings. He brought up artifacts. They brought up several mule carts full of artifacts in brass and marble. It was real. This wasn't just a fairy tale. Stuff actually came off the bottom, and as I'll get to in a minute, we know that the ships were there and were real. So he says that the dives were essentially limited in duration only by cold and fatigue. Like, from here up, you'd be super hot because it's this humid, hot, exhaled air in the top of the diving bell. And from here down, you're super cold because you're wading around in a volcanic lake in the middle of Italy, and the water's pretty chilly. And apparently fish are biting at you-know-what from time to time. Anyway, they explore the whole length of the ship. They do some really good work. They do look at the possibility of pulling the whole thing up, and it's not possible. It wasn't possible in 1446. It's not possible in 1535 either. But that is basically the first underwater archaeology. They weren't doing this to try to get treasure and sell it. They were actually just doing it to try and learn about the ships and about where they came from. One of the things, by the way, that is recovered at this early time period are lead pipes from the ship. Did I mention that the ship had hot and cold running water? Because of course it did. It was Caligula's freaking floating Mega-Yacht palace. It had pressurized hot and cold running water in the ship. And the lead pipes that they bring up are actually stamped with Caligula's name, and that's a common thing in Roman piping, and like that's all the evidence anyone really needed at that point to know that these were Caligula's ships. They're also recorded by some Roman historians at the time. Anyway, after these two guys finish their exploration, the ships kind of sink back into obscurity for about another 300 years. And it's in 1827 when another Italian guy shows up to try and lift the ship again. He has the same idea as they did in the 1400s of, we'll build a big floating barge and we'll put some hooks down on the ship and we'll just lift it up off the bottom. Because the buoyancy of our barge will be greater than the weight of the ship. And his plan in 1827 fails for exactly the same reason that it did in the 1400s, namely all of, like, the ships are stuck in the mud and weigh a lot more than anybody was really engineering this sort of system around. He's got a raft of, like, a lot of wine barrels for buoyancy. And they spend some time trying to make this work in 1827. Winter comes along, and he heads home to better climates for the winter. When he comes back in the spring and discovers that the local peasants have salvaged his raft and made use of all the wine barrels for storing wine, and he doesn't have the money to reconstitute it. So that ends that attempt to raise the ships. There is another guy who comes back in 1895, and by this time we have kind of basically modern dive gear, hard hat, helmet, dive gear, and he starts diving on the wreck, actually both of the wrecks, and he starts bringing up treasure. Well, sort of treasure: bronze castings, bronze statues, marble, opus sectile, tile flooring, all sorts of cool artifact stuff. And he's doing this specifically to sell, and that works for a brief period until the Italian government decides that maybe this stuff is more important to, for historical purposes and for state patrimony than it is for one dude to make an agreement with the landowner to just crowbar off the wreck and sell at the open market. And so in 1896, the Italian government stops him from continuing this salvage. They start about 10 years of surveying the wrecks to try and figure out, like, what can we do with these? They want to raise them as well. By this point, people have realized that the wrecks are in, well, this series of surveys finally determines that not only are these really big shipwrecks and they're really heavy, but they're also in really poor condition. 400, 500 years now of reckless salvage, of trying to rip bits off the top of the vessels, have seriously damaged them. You know, the upper construction is pretty well destroyed at this point, and there's no effective way to raise the ships. So what are you going to do? How do you get access to them? Well, Mussolini comes along, and he is he's got the Roman emperor mindset going, would really like to see himself as a new world, you know, a modern era Roman emperor. And so he thinks raising these mega yachts is a pretty cool idea. Well, how do we do it? We'll drain the lake. If we can't bring the boats up, we'll bring the water down. And they set about doing this in 1929. Hilariously to me, they actually discover an existing Roman tunnel system that was intended to keep the lake from overflooding, that they're able to repair, slap on some big mechanical pumps, and use to pump the water out of the lake. It takes a couple of years. The pumps are started in October 1929, and it's not until March of 1930 that they see the top of the first ship start to come through. Eventually, by the end of 1932, they have fully revealed both of the ships. They don't completely drain all the water out of the lake, but they drain it enough that both shipwrecks are on dry land. There is an immense amount of work that goes into excavating and stabilizing the two ships. Of course, once the water's gone, then you're really on the clock to preserve these things lest they just completely dry out and fall apart. But they do that. Italian archaeologists pull it off. They build a museum a couple hundred yards away, up outside of the lake's normal zone. They build a museum to house these two ships, and, you know, build a track system, and they put the whole ship onto a set of wooden cradles. They bring it up into the museum. The museum's completed in 1935 or 36. They bring the ships in. The museum is inaugurated April 21, Rome's birthday, 1939, to go on display, and it's amazing. Like, there are pictures that survive from the early years of the museum that, like, super cool. They literally recovered both shipwrecks from the bottom of Lake Nemi and put them in a museum. That lasts 5 years, because in 1944, towards the end of World War II, there is fighting going on in the area. There's apparently a German anti-aircraft battery that starts in the Nemi area that starts taking fire from American artillery, and something, and then the museum catches fire. And there still appears to be some controversy over whether it was American artillery shells that set the museum on fire, or if it was the German crew of the local German garrison that came under fire, abandoned the position, retreated, and deliberately set the museum and everything else on fire on their way out. The report at the time in 1944 was that the Germans did it. That was potentially colored by the Italian government at the time wanting to play nice with the Allies. Blaming it on Germany is a little better, a little more politically kosher at the time. Later reports looked at potentially this was actually American artillery fire that did it. I don't think we really know for sure at this point. Maybe we never will. But the museum survived. It was made of concrete and steel, but both of the boats burned away to complete nothing. So the museum did reopen in 1953 with kind of apparently rather sad 1/5 scale replicas in the same gallery halls that originally held the full-size things. Within the last few years, there have been projects to build reconstructions of both ships. I'm not sure exactly what the status of those is now, but talk about an incredibly, like, just a cool and bizarre story, going from the giant pleasure mega yachts of Caligula to 1500s first secret dive helmet technology salvage and archaeology efforts, through to fascist dictator drains a lake to save a couple of Roman artifacts. I think it's a fantastically interesting story, one of many, many things lurking beneath the water. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.